Hello, this is the Aligned Birth Podcast. You've got Doula Rachael here and Dr. Shannon, and we are the hosts of the Aligned Birth Podcast. Today, we are talking about questions to ask your OB, your provider, your midwife, when choosing who you want as your provider for your birth. I think the single most important thing as to why this is important, and we always have little outlines that we go by for the show. And in our outline, the first thing we have up there is, why is this important? And the first bullet point that we have is that the provider has the greatest influence over birth outcomes. So that's why we're talking about it today. We want to talk about questions that you can ask, how you can ask them, why you need to ask them, why there's, certain questions that we have there, how to ask them throughout your care. It's not like you just ask it once and it's done. And then ways to ask the questions as well too. So there's lots of different nuances and things that go into here, but then it's a matter of what do you do with the information that you get from their answer. And sometimes it's not just the answer that you get, right? It's how the question is answered as well too. So we'll touch on all of those things today. Welcome to the Aligned Birth Podcast. I'm Dr. Shannon, a prenatal chiropractor.
And I'm Rachael, a birth doula and childbirth educator. Together, we're here to bring you conversations about pregnancy, birth, and motherhood. From cesarean to VBAC, hospital to home births, we've experienced it all. We are high school friends who reconnected through our shared passion for health and birth. As moms to two young boys, we've both changed careers after our own transformative childbirth experiences.
Join us as we discuss the importance of a healthy body and mind throughout pregnancy, birth, and into motherhood. Our goal is to provide fun, interesting, and helpful conversations and interviews that inspire learning. When your body, mind, and intuition are aligned, you can conquer anything.
Sit back and relax, or grab a notebook and take some notes, or maybe listen as you enjoy a walk. However you choose to listen, we hope you enjoy this episode of the Aligned Birth Podcast. Before we get into the episode today, if you enjoy the content of this podcast, we would greatly appreciate your support in one of three ways. First, leave us a review or give us a 5-star rating. Your feedback helps us reach more listeners and make a bigger impact. Second, you can sign up for our newsletter. By doing so, you'll be the first to receive new episodes and exclusive bonus resources straight to your inbox each week. Lastly, you can become a direct listener supporter. Running this podcast requires significant time, effort, and resources. Your contribution, no matter the amount, helps us continue providing valuable content to a wider audience. Simply use the links in the show notes to make your donation, sign up for our newsletter, or leave us a review. Every contribution matters and is sincerely appreciated. If the Aligned Birth Podcast is a part of your weekly routine and you love what we are doing, please consider supporting us through one of these three options. Your support will create a ripple effect, allowing us to reach more listeners and make a lasting difference.
Welcome to the show, Rachael.
Hi, Dr. Shannon. Thank you for getting us into this conversation so beautifully and eloquently. I'm very excited for our conversation. As always, this is one topic that comes up a lot as a birth doula when we have expecting mothers who are trying to decide on a provider, like from the beginning. Like, we get this a lot in consultations, because that's earlier in pregnancy and they maybe haven't settled on a provider. And we're always like, hey, we got this great list of questions you can ask your provider when you're trying to make a decision. And we share it with them right away, even if they don't hire us. And then this can also come up as they are getting through, like they're going through pregnancy, they've chosen a provider, and we're like, okay, now really get to know your provider. You can kind of like drip the questions throughout pregnancy to make sure you are continuing to stay in alignment with your provider. And and that all your preferences and desires are being addressed and met, your concerns, your fears, and you're learning a little bit more about them and how they might support you or their practice. We heard, recently was just talking to one of our clients, and she was like, well, why should I ask these questions? Because I don't know who's going to be at my birth. And that's a valid point. But we would say, this is kind of just giving you some insight, because a lot of times as a practice, they have overarching ways that they approach or handle birth. So you can ask, as a practice, how do you handle this? And as an individual, and then each time you see a new provider, you can kind of gain some insight into that person. And so it's not saying, oh, well, you're going to be the one who's there, I need to know exactly what you're going to do. It's just an overall insight into them and the practice, and aiming for alignment with your provider. Right?
I like that use of the word, aligned birth, to
Yeah.
help you have an aligned birth experience.
Yes. It matters being in alignment. A lot of people are like, well, I don't care what they say because I'm just going to go in and do what I want. Hey, awesome. We don't want you to feel like you have to go in with boxing gloves, though. We don't want you to feel like you got to be an uphill battle. It's good to be prepared to advocate, but when you're in alignment, that means you're going to have less friction, less opportunity of needing to put on your boxing gloves.
No, I'm glad you mentioned that though too, because sometimes I feel like it can come across as that, as I guess with more and more talk now about you have the ability to choose this provider, you don't have to stick with them, you can fire a provider at any time. You don't want to go into it, I don't know, already on the defensive.
Right.
End of things. It's kind of coming in and asking, and then getting that read on them as far as, okay, well, this is how they responded. This is what they said, made you feel a certain way, but not necessarily going in and already being combative.
Yeah. And then if they give you an answer that you don't necessarily, again, align with, have a conversation. They're your provider. They are human. You are human. It doesn't have to be black and white, especially if it's someone you're I really want to be with this provider. This is where I've been. I'm comfortable here for the most part. If they give you a response that you're not feeling good about, it's tell me more. Do you have an article that I could read that's supportive of what you're saying? Or can I share this article that I found about this particular thing? It can, aiming for this dialogue. I'm not saying it's achievable in every scenario, but it doesn't have to be if they say the wrong thing, I have to fire them. It's well, stay curious, stay involved, sometimes just having a conversation can soften them and bring them around and help them okay, I can support that or whatever. There can be some growth on both sides.
Most definitely. So we talked about provider has greatest influence over our birth outcome. So that's why this is important. And practicing throughout your pregnancy with them asking these questions can help further along in asking those questions, not just while you're giving birth and, in the heat of the moment type of thing. So exercising that muscle a little bit as well too. And then just increase that connection with your provider, because they are going to share a very intimate space with you. So you want to feel comfortable, seen, heard, acknowledged as well in that birth space. I think one big thing with it is really helping you become an active participant instead of just that passive receiver. So I always look at it as being that active participant in the birth, instead of birth just something that happened to you. Because if you're feeling that it was something that happened to you, then that can impact your postpartum recovery. And I know with my first, I had a birth plan. It definitely went out the window, but I feel like, and I say this very lightly, I could have done that better, but I didn't know what I didn't know. So now I use that experience to impart information on the second one. But I felt a little bulldozed, and not in a bad way. My providers are really good, but it was more of it just was something that was happening to me, because it was this cascade of events. And so I really didn't kind of stop to ask questions or things there too. But that wasn't necessarily the best time to ask those questions. It would have been good to ask those questions kind of beforehand. So that's why I do like this aspect of an approach to creating that relationship with your provider and being comfortable with them as well, kind of like early on. I know that's a big one though.
Yeah. And just to validate like your experience of like kind of being on the train and feeling like you can't get off, even though it's like overall okay experience, but like this, and you weren't bulldozed, but you felt just like things were happening. Like that's a not normal, common experience. And you know, I think hindsight's always 20/20. You can always look back but in the moment, like when things are happening, it's hard to tap into these things if you've never tapped into them before or weren't exposed to them. Right. And so that's why we know it's important to have like talk about it beforehand and practice and exercise beforehand, to avoid that or reduce that feeling overall. We think keys to choosing a provider. So there's like questions to ask provider and then like how to choose a provider. So there's like before you've committed to a provider. And I do encourage you, if you like just found out you're pregnant, and you've been like with this one practice, you know, since you were 16, that it's okay to explore other options for providers, because birth is different than GYN care, and finding someone who's going to support the birth in the way that you want. And you can always return to your provider for GYN care if you want, that it's not like, it's okay to explore options and see if there's someone that's a better fit for you. Because again, how the provider you have for the type of birth you want matters. And so if you're early on exploring your options and you use these questions to sort of like interview providers. And again, I like to recommend meet with 1, 2, or 3 different providers. I know that feels like a lot of work, but this is a big event for your, you know, for your life. And so it's worth it. It's so worth it. And you can get a lot of, you know, meet with a midwife, meet with an OB, meet with a hospital midwife and a home birth midwife, like kind of, and that can be insightful and that can help you kind of have a whole picture of what's available out there. And then you use these questions, like you said, throughout pregnancy to build practice. You're exercising your muscle and you're building connection by using these questions. But some keys to this process is listening to your gut. What is it telling you? How do you feel in the office, in the presence of the provider, in the presence of the staff? How are you feeling? And I think we highlight this a lot in our conversations, because how you feel through the process matters. Like, it's not a stamp of like, only midwives are going to make you feel safe and comfortable. It's not. It's whoever you are. It's good to kind of meet with different people to see. And if you've only ever met with an OB, you don't really know that a midwife could make you feel differently. If you've only met with a midwife, you don't know that an OB can make you feel differently. So when you have that contrast, you're able to say, oh, I felt more at ease here. I felt more comfortable here. I felt more safe. I felt more seen, heard. So really paying attention to how you feel when you're going through this process. So listening to your gut, asking questions, which we're going to go over a list of questions to ask. And then another key is seeking referrals from people you trust who've had birthing experiences similar to what you desire. So, you know, like there's a lot of different like places you can give birth that support it differently. But if you're really wanting a certain type of birth, like an unmedicated water birth, try and seek out referrals from people who have actually experienced that, where they did it, who they were with, and what their experience was. If you know you want an epidural, but you still want to have like low intervention, like try to seek people out who have had a similar experience and then go meet like, okay, who was your provider? And then try and use that as like a launching pad for how to choose. Because otherwise it can feel really overwhelming. How do I choose? It's so many options. Where we're in the greater Atlanta area, it's like insane.
There's a lot.
There's a lot. And so that's a good way to start. And then don't wait till it's too late to address red flags. So once you've gone through the process of committing to a provider for your birth, if there are like yellow flags meaning like you get a little bit of an uh-oh feeling. It's like an answer they gave you about something really didn't align with you and they weren't responsive to your questions surrounding it, or they were dismissive, or they're not supportive of the most important things to you. Those are red flags, yellow to red flags. So pay attention and try to consider switching providers before it feels like it's too late. Because the later you get, it's never too late to switch providers, but the later you get, the bigger of a deal it feels like it is for you. It might feel more stressful if you're
It's more
36 weeks,
stressful.
right? So like you can minimize that by trying to pay attention and address things sooner rather than later, so that you're not in that like final weeks of pregnancy feeling like you need to switch. But if you are, please know you can switch and go wherever you want. I just listened to a birth story about someone in labor. What podcast was it on? I don't know. I'd have to go back and look. But she was in labor and at a hospital, and they were treating her very poorly and being very dismissive and wanting to like rush things along. And I'm pretty sure the quote, like the nurse, this is a birth story from the birth person. The nurse came in and was like, "You need to SHIT or get off the pot," meaning like we need to get things going. And they basically packed their stuff up and left and drove to like another hospital where they hadn't been. It's not like they didn't have a doctor there. They didn't have,
but they're going to take you because,
but they'll take you. And they felt like, I'm not safe here. This is not a good environment for me. Whereas like, if you got that kind of abuse, you might feel like I'm stuck here. I don't have, I mean, again, if you're in a place where there's not like another hospital, of course, maybe you're stuck, but just an example of like, you can just leave.
Talk about, at the last minute.
In labor. I was like, wow. Okay. So some of those keys. And then the phrasing, which you and I care a lot about, the phrasing of the question. So mindful of using allow. So like, do you allow me to go beyond 40 weeks? Do you allow me to push in other positions besides my back? What are the answer to that question?
Just give a one-word answer.
Yes or no. Yes or no. Flip the script. How do you support, and then ask your question. So how do you support me going beyond 40 weeks? How do you support me laboring without an epidural, right? Like, and that phrasing then they have to kind of give a little bit more of an it's an open-ended question. So they kind of got to give more of an answer with more words. And so you learn a little bit more about.
And again, it's not only what they're saying, but it's how they're saying it as well.
Yeah.
That's where your intuition is going to come into, because they could still give a response that, if you're saying, will you allow me to go past 40 weeks? If you say, how do you support that instead? They could still give an answer that is very similar as what they would have said, we don't, or something like that. So you've got to read into what the response is as well. And that might be a little bit more of like the yellow flag aspect of
if
things.
They're being evasive or not clear, or we'll cross that bridge when we get there. It should be unequivocally, we support you going to, at 41 weeks, we will begin recommending induction, or we support you all the way to 42 weeks, or really at 40 weeks, that's when we're going to recommend induction, or whatever. It's like they have to sort of tell you more. If they aren't giving you information, like you said, that's a yellow flag or red flag.
Or it could be red flag. I know. So with these questions, I want to ask you, it's not just like a one and done type of thing, is it?
Right.
Like you ask this question once, maybe you ask it like you're 12 weeks, and you're starting to do, other things are starting to come up in other questions. Is that it? Or do you ask them again? Like, how do you go through with these questions with clients?
Yeah, I think we have a whole list of questions, and we'll share these in the show notes, but I say pick the things that are most important to you. It's not like you're going to literally go in and ask all of these questions. At least in my experience, that's not typically what happens. People tend to extract the questions that are most important to them. If you're interviewing providers, you're going to find some questions that help you gain more of an overview of philosophy of birth, how they support the type of birth you want, some general stuff. And then once you've committed to a provider, then you can kind of at each appointment, use that time to pick a handful of questions to ask. And then at each appointment, you're going to kind of ask, either if it's a different provider and you want to ask the same set of questions just to get an overview of each provider, or each time you're going to ask different questions just to sort of get all the information you need throughout your time with them. that tends to be an actual like attainable approach versus like asking all the questions in one visit. That just doesn't tend to be realistic. So there's like your interview questions, which are going to give you more of an overview, and then trying to have a few questions at each appointment that you ask to build throughout. But again, I think it's just being willing to ask some of these questions, whatever aligns with you, whatever's most important to you, and honing in on those is going to be the best approach.
And you can ask them again too,
Yes.
when it goes later, because sometimes too, you may have different things that pop up in your pregnancy. So maybe you weren't necessarily, asking things about blood sugar levels or gestational diabetes, but then if something does pop up and you do have that, you can ask for that, because if it's immediately certain things that they're recommending, but they're not necessarily mentioning any dietary changes, that you could do to help support yourself, like you can ask, you may not have asked that question earlier. You can ask it later, or you can, if you've
the
asked it
questions
earlier,
might
you can ask it
change
again.
then, like, because now there needs to be some things, maybe a different plan or a different course of action. So yeah, it's again, always being curious and always asking questions that are specific to where you're at in your pregnancy, what has come up, if there's been things that have come up, like, that are changing
positioning, there's lots
the route. Yeah. So I think, it's both, and I think it's being okay with asking questions kind of over and over again, being willing to kind of change what you're asking depending on what's come up, and just kind of always being comfortable and exercising asking questions, so that, again, I think it's more of just like this exercise that benefits your overall experience. And then the other thing we tell our clients too is like, because it's a long list of questions that we feel like are like comprehensive. And if it's too much for an appointment, because sometimes either like you're ready to get out of there, they're rushing you, which again, that's not optimal, but like if it just doesn't feel right in between appointments, you can always like email the office, or if you have a portal with them, if they're like a medical provider, they sometimes have portals and you can send messages or call and ask for like a out of appointment phone call. Like, can you have the midwife call me back? I have some extra questions I'd like to ask. Or can I leave my questions with the nurse and then the midwife can call me back? Like in between your appointments, so that you have time to ask your questions, and that maybe you're more comfortable sending them in an email or having a conversation on the phone versus like you're sitting in a quote unquote doctor's office feeling like stressed just by being there. And I will say, like, a lot of my examples right now are like medical model of care versus like home birth.
I didn't think about that when we were kind of,
so home birth, like, you have more time at your appointments. Like they usually allot like 45 minutes to an hour. They want to get to know you. They want to make sure you're eating well, exercising well, all your questions are answered. Like they always allot a lot of time, whereas like medical model of care, and traditionally it's like 15 minutes you might get. That's including everything. So less time. So there's like less of this like environment that's fostering like this open dialogue. So knowing like that there are other options if that's really important to you. And then these questions are definitely more geared towards giving birth in the hospital versus at home, but they could still apply.
No, they could definitely still apply. But yeah. Okay, so how do we want to do this? Do we want to go through our questions?
Yeah, we wanted to share with you guys like a sampling of some questions to ask, and we're not going to like go deep on each question because then we might be here for several hours, but it's just, again, planting seeds, helping you stay curious, helping you like think outside the box of things to ask. We're going to include these in the show notes so you don't have to like write them all down. You can go grab them from there. But yeah, I think we should just run through them.
Okay. Yeah.
And if you want to do the list, and then if there's anything to add at the end, we'll do that.
Okay. Okay, so our first one here, we have, what do you view as your role and my role in achieving a safe and healthy birth? And again, too, we talked about how these can be interchangeable with, like, some of these would be good for home birth, midwives
Absolutely.
as well too.
Because if you're interviewing providers, you want to have a set of questions that you can ask them.
Mm-hmm.
So that would include home birth midwives.
Mm-hmm. What is your philosophy on the normal processes of pregnancy, labor, and birth? And how do you support physiological birth? Another one, let's see. What kind of childbirth preparation do you recommend? That's a good one. How do you define and handle complications?
And that's a good one for home birth, like understanding. You can ask
Mm-hmm.
that at home birth midwives too, because sometimes a lot of people need that boost of confidence of understanding.
They've got a plan.
They have a plan. They have the training.
Mm-hmm.
They know what they're doing. And when you hear it from them and they explain it, how they handle complications, you're like, oh, okay. That makes me feel better.
It makes it a lot less scary.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. How do you feel about working with doulas? That's a big one. Because not every hospital and not every OB is going to be good with that.
No,
I know of doulas, and I don't know if you guys are, in that realm of not going to specific hospitals because to support a birth, not because they don't want to help, but because it's such an uphill battle.
Yep.
And it's exhaustive.
There's a few in the area that we just don't go to for that reason. And that's unfortunate.
Mm-hmm.
And if we have people reaching out to us who are planning to give birth at any of the locations that we don't feel like is optimal, we share that with them. Mm-hmm. And then we let them know like the reasons. And then here you're, if you want to transfer to one of the places we serve, we'd welcome the conversation. And sometimes that prompts them to be like, oh, like if this place isn't friendly with doulas, like, do I even want to be there? And sometimes like, okay, you're not the doula for me. There's plenty of doulas serving at all of these places. But yeah, it's, it can be insightful. And there are home birth midwives who don't love doulas either. So, if you really want a doula, then you make sure you want to have a provider who believes in doula support as well.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. How do you support, so do you hear how the question is asked? How do you support moving and changing positions during labor? How do you support the pushing stage? Those are
if they say with you on your back.
Or they're like, there's only one way. Yeah. What is your rate for cesarean birth? Now, as you go through these, you can figure out, okay, these are really important to me. This is what I'm going to want to know right off the get-go. And so it's almost like you want to maybe come up with that childbirth prep plan, because then that lets you know what kind of birth experience do you want. We did a whole episode on that because you talked about reverse engineering that birth plan. So then it's like, how do you want to feel? And then how do you set yourself up for that? Then you can dictate some of the questions that you ask. So
yeah. Well, and if it's like the reverse engineering is like, and a lot of people don't want a cesarean, but like, I really want to do everything I can to avoid a cesarean. Okay. Knowing the cesarean rate at each hospital is that like a step in the right direction. It's not guaranteeing you'll have a cesarean, but if you go to the place that has the highest rate, then you're like you're kind of like, it's that step towards, it's increasing your chance,
yes,
right?
Exactly. Maybe not setting yourself up for optimal
and just
success.
That knowledge is like, oh, I didn't even know I could have access to that information.
That. I know.
Like, there's a hospital in the Atlanta area that doesn't report and they have the highest rates.
I'm like, so yes, what is your rate for cesarean birth? What is your hospital's cesarean rate? Those are good things.
Those are different. Those are different. Provider has rates and the hospital has rates.
Because the hospitals, other providers are feeding into those hospitals as well too. What circumstances necessitate a cesarean birth as well? So if that is something that is very important to you to know, then I would, you could bunch those questions together and you could maybe know right off the bat how you're feeling. Yeah. How do you support, again, listen to the question, how do you support going beyond 40 weeks? What circumstances necessitate induction of labor? I really like that one. If you're looking for that vaginal birth after cesarean, you're going to want to ask their specific policy for induction, augmentation of labor. We did a whole episode on gentle inductions. You have options with inductions. You have options with those things, and that's why it's important. It
But
doesn't have to be
some
so cut and
places
dry.
don't offer induction for VBAC or augmentation for VBAC. So like that could rule you out of trial of labor if they aren't supportive or you don't know your options there. So like if you don't ask, you don't know, and then you're there and it's like, oh shoot.
Exactly. So that's why that's a really good one. What interventions or practices do you use routinely during labor and birth? So this might deal with, and you talked about, this is why our vocab series that we did a 4-part series on vocabulary words is really important, because you may not even know what some of these words mean. And, pregnancy brings out a whole
how
new
they
vocab.
apply.
But restricting eating and drinking, we've done an episode on that as well too. AROM, so the artificial rupture of membranes, there's electronic fetal monitoring, IV fluids, epidural, like those common interventions in a hospital setting. You want to know, how often do they routinely use those?
And are they considered routine? Are they doing it to everyone regardless of your circumstances and your medical state? Or are there options in there? Can you decline? Or are they like, supporting not doing things unless they're necessary? So routine means like if you're choosing to give birth there, then these things are being offered or done regardless of necessity. Now, epidural, not as much, but the other 4 would be considered routine. Epidural, but again, are they pushing epidural? Are they supportive of you not wanting an epidural? So
exactly. How do you manage the second stage of labor? So that would be pushing. When do you find it medically necessary to perform an episiotomy? I hear a lot of issues with tearing in the office, or just concerns, cares. That seems to be a real big one. So if that is big and important to you, then you want to ask that question to kind of get a read on their answer.
Well, an episiotomy too, a lot of people are like, well, yeah, no, I don't want an episiotomy. Like most people would say that. That's where they cut, right? And the rates for episiotomy are significantly lower than they used to be. But this question, what it's asking is like, when would you cut? What are some medical reasons that would necessitate episiotomy versus just like letting you tear? And tearing is superior to cutting.
Or healing, recovery, all of that. Let's see. What do you consider to be delayed cord clamping? So again, that's another flip on asking of, would you allow delayed cord clamping? Okay, what is let
them explain to you.
And what is it? Is it a time frame are they going to give you? Is it look and see at the cord type of thing? Because it might be different for everybody. So again, you want to listen to the answers that they give. And you can listen to the answer that they give and then take it and then go home and then mentally digest it. It's not like you've got to come up and be like, okay, you're going to be my doctor. Listen to these answers. You could take some time and then chat again with your partner and see. I don't know if we've mentioned this, but as far as looking at like, also not only how are you feeling about the provider, but how does your partner feel about the provider and the responses that they gave? And kind of making sure
bring
you
them along
have
this journey
to be on the same page. But if they're getting, like a bad feeling from it, or they're just not liking the answers, then that can spark a conversation as far as what did you like, what did you not like, and why.
Well, that's the beginning processes of bringing the partner in and getting them engaged, because they might be like, I don't know, I don't care, it's not me, but it's like kind of getting them to care and understand why it matters.
How do you manage the delivery of my placenta, watchful or expectant? I remember we did that episode too about, I think it was in the terms with the fungal massage and all of those. And I was like, wait a minute, I didn't have to have that? Like, we didn't have to do that. I did not know that.
Are you pulling on the cord traction? Are you waiting for it to come on its own? What's the time frame? Again, how do you manage this phase? Yeah.
What is the policy for prolonged rupture of membranes? So kind of over that 24-hour period, typically that 24 hours is where they want something to happen before, 24 hours. But what is the follow through kind of after that?
Yeah. And there's new evidence on the time frame with certain conditions being met. So if they're like we want to see you baby here by this time, or you in labor by this time. There's some evidence on, that. And so seeing what they say there is really, really important, because just usually for most people, they just need a little bit more time to kick into labor. With the numbers, the percentages supporting, like by 24 hours, it's like 80 something % are in labor on their own. So like giving it time. But how do they support that? Yeah.
I see a lot of fetal malposition in that aspect of things too. And that's not the only reason why you have ruptured membranes.
When we have prolonged ruptured membranes, we're like, go see your chiropractor.
I'm like, curb walking, we're doing all the things. I know. Yeah. And then what are the standard newborn care procedures? That is important to ask, even though that doesn't seem directly related to birth, but what do you want to happen right after? Do you want baby immediately taken away and cleaned and washed and then given to you? Or do you want everybody to just leave if baby is fine? You have a say in that. I think that's the big part of the episode is I hope looking at these questions and hearing these questions sparks in someone so that they're like, oh, I didn't know that I could ask these questions. Do I feel comfortable asking someone in a white coat these questions? I get that. I get that.
Totally.
But I don't know. They want you to. I think if they want that meaningful relationship, they do want to have those conversations with you. So I think these are good ones to go through and check in with how you feel. And hopefully it gives you some insight into things to add maybe to a birth plan, the birth preference list. I mean, it kind of, childbirth education classes. Yeah. How else can you support
and if
yourself?
Some of these questions, you're like, I don't even know what an episiotomy is, or I didn't know there was a phase where what placenta
the placenta is delivered. Yeah.
Like all of a sudden. And so, or delayed cord clamping, I don't know what that is, or I don't know my preferences there. It's 100% what you're saying of like that, exploratory, like if in this list of questions, there are things you're not sure of, that's an opportunity to go learn about what it is and what could be your range of options. And then when you're learning about it, what sounds good to you as far as like the care around that thing. And then when you ask these questions, you're a little bit more prepared to like have a response of like, I like that or I don't like that. Right. But if you don't know about the thing, it's hard to feel like you have a preference. And so learning about it is definitely part of the key. So if you're not familiar with these, it's okay. Listen to our other podcasts. Take a childbirth education class.
Yep.
Stay curious, and tap into your intuition. It will not fail you. I promise.
So we'll put all of those questions in the show notes. And hopefully you've learned some new vocab words today, even in our non-vocab lesson.
Always a lesson.
Always.
So fun chatting with you today. Thank you, Dr. Shannon.
Yep. Always fun.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us on the Aligned Birth Podcast. We hope you found our discussions informative, inspiring, and enjoyable. Remember, when your body, mind, and intuition are aligned, you have the power to overcome any challenge that comes your way. We appreciate your support and leaving a review or rating, signing up for our newsletter, or becoming a direct listener supporter. Your contribution helps us continue delivering valuable content and reaching more listeners like yourself. Stay connected with us through our newsletter to receive the latest episodes and bonuses straight to your inbox each week. You can also connect with us on Instagram at aligned_birth. All links can be found in the show notes. Together, we can make a difference in the lives of the birthing individuals and new moms. Thank you for being a part of our community. We look forward to sharing more empowering conversations on the Aligned Birth Podcast. Until next time.